Welcome to the West Coast Sojourn podcast. I'm Donnell Alexander,
I'm Lev Anderson.
and our guest this week is the great, and what's the word I used, venerable cannabis journalist, Lauren Yoshiko. You knew her from the Broccoli Report and now Sticky Bits. We'll talk about her book last year, and we'll talk her book from last year, and we'll talk a little bit about coping as a journalist who has to look at this madness. A lot of you get to tune out this stuff, and some of us are locked in. Lev is learning to be locked in. Lev told me a story that connected the old days of cannabis in Oregon with the kind of stuff we'll be talking about in this episode. So I thought maybe you could share. What's this guy's name again?
Jeffrey Joseph, rest in peace, Jeff. Jeff grew up in Brentwood, and I remember I met him when I worked at Music Millennium in high school. Music Millennium is a record
Mm,
shop in Portland,
on
and
Burnside.
up on Burnside. And I remember him telling me how, like when he told me he was from Brentwood, I was like, "Oh yeah, O.J. Simpson, ha ha ha," and he was like, "That bastard," and I was like, "What?" And he was like, "When the helicopters were trying to find him, I had to throw all my plants off the roof of the house." um, but long time marijuana advocate, hemp advocate. He was one of the first people in Portland selling hemp twine to the hippies to make their necklaces and jewelry. He was making his own like hemp clothing from fabric he was importing from Hungary on China, I think. And, he was just all about it. Knew Jack Herrera. He was like on the front lines of legalization. When the medical thing happened in California, at least he had opened up a dispensary in Santa Monica. Um, I think it was a fairly thriving business because when he got busted by the authorities for mismanaging the dispensary, I don't know if he was dodging tax laws or something, but they talked about how they found $50,000 cash in his car. Um, Again, that might go and, as a commentary on the ongoing struggle of these businesses to do regular banking in this country. But he became like kind of the poster boy of how not to do dispensaries. And I'm like driving down 405. This is when I lived in Orange County, and I hear on KCRW or whatever, they're like, marijuana dispensary owner Jeffrey Joseph is now being going to serve 6 months in federal jail for blah blah blah. I don't remember exactly what it was, and I was just like, holy shit. And then I don't know if I had seen him uh, after he got out, but apparently he had a little bit of land up in Humboldt and went up to visit it because somebody else had been managing it for him while he was in prison and disappeared.
Managing
And
his land. What does that mean? Managing that land.
keeping an eye out on it. I mean, pre-legalization, and I think it's still like that around here, is those folks up in Humboldt, they don't fuck around. They are,
Yeah,
that's kind of like cartel-ish up there when it came
you
to
were
the
talking
marijuana
about
industry.
it's Murder Mountain stuff, right?
Yeah, so the Netflix put out a documentary called Murder Mountain about all these like unsolved murders up in Humboldt County around the cannabis trade. And Jeff was one of the victims, and he never got to see the legalization of recreation marijuana, and I always felt bad for that. He was a nice guy. He was a little bit of a hardcore warrior, and you
Hardcore
know
what?
warrior. Like he had no compromise in him when it came to marijuana and advocacy for it, which is great for an advocate, right? You need that, but it also I think probably made life a little more difficult for him too. And I think he wasn't that good of a businessman because my guess is that he was in debt to people or something.
Mm, mm.
Um, and
You think that
just
led to his demise?
yes, probably. Um, but yeah, kind of sad story. I just remember I think his sister still has a Facebook page for him. Does anybody, have any idea what happened? And
You think people remember
that's
him
it.
up in Oregon?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some people, but yeah, I mean, it's been a few years now. So, I mention him because, I think, he's worth being remembered. And I don't, I'm sure it's just faded in the background. And with legalization, the scene is totally different here, but he was definitely about it.
We had a conversation off mic with Lauren about this, and she was saying how she loves the old school Oregon stories. And, it's interesting to have someone on who has a handle on a lot of cannabis stories because, it's so underground. Most of the stories still go unreported. The legends still go unreported. I mean, nobody knows who that guy is. And what was it like? What was your impression talking to a cannabis journalist? Have you ever interviewed or sat in on a conversation with somebody like that?
Not really. I mean, she seemed thoroughly informed about all the different aspects of the business and like kind of the key issues facing the business as it grows into the semi-legal operation. And I think she did a good job of elucidating the kind of the gray area that a lot of this world functions in. And I had no idea about the hemp THC thing. I'm glad to know that. I think that was
That
very interesting, and I'm gonna look
that's
into
one
that too.
that's one of the things that for me, I read about it literally every fucking week, and I think about this isn't really a story, but if you talk to people outside of the bubble, you go, "Holy shit, that's kind of crazy," and it's a national story. Some of the stuff you brought up, that question about consuming so much media, I was thinking about it after you asked, and I thought that's not really just a journalist question.
It's kind of a crazy time we're in, folks. I
And
think too, it's interesting because with technology, right, that speeds up events. And I think that's something we forget about is that, the invention of the newspaper or whatever, like that's kind of sped up the the process of actual events going on because information could be shared more widely, more quickly. And then so, with the invention of the internet and tweeting and everything else, it feels
mhm.
like things can just happen so much quicker. So much, is going on. And obviously, the Trump administration is just good at the overload.
Yeah, I
Um,
think in a lot of ways the story of this Trump phenomena, Trump 2.0, if you will, is a technological story. It is a story about winning through, media forms that weren't really a thing 15 years ago, whether you're talking about what Twitter has become or the podcast phenomenon.
right. They've kind of created this whole conservative ecosystem of media sources with Newsmax and America. What is it? AON News or whatever.
Yeah,
Um,
America's something. America's most wanted. It's the conservative thing, but I've talked
America's
about
backwoods fuckers.
America's hypocrites. Listen, it's not just the perspective, the rightness of it, the right wingness of it, but I watched this movie. I don't know if you're old enough to remember it, but a movie called Absence of Malice with Sally Field and Paul Newman, two very appealing actors, by the way. But it was this
I've seen
journalism.
Network. I haven't seen
Oh,
that one, but I know
Network's
Network.
great. Network's
Yeah.
great. This wasn't a great film, but it was about this issue of a journalist who exposes someone who is being used by the police as a to fish out a story, what they call a fishing expedition, and she kind of screws up his life. But at the beginning in the opening sequence, they show all the machinations, the machinery of putting out a newspaper. They're showing the printing press and the ink plates and all that. And I was like, if you showed any of my children this, they would be like, what are they trying to convey? And that's how far back it is. And something I wanted to bring up with Lauren, and we were talking about the future and all that, is this weekend I heard someone say a conversation. One of these guys, a guy from, are you familiar with Semaphore? Semaphore is a like one of these upscale journalism brands from New
Yeah,
York.
yeah, yeah.
And the guy said that he had a bunch of influencers on his podcast, his Semaphore podcast, and he said something like, so when did you get interested in journalism? And he said, what? Don't call me that. I've never been interested in journalism. It's like a
Oh,
pejorative
Jesus.
right now. And it's one of those things you go, we got there so fast. There have been, decades of sliding popularity about journalists, but the point where it became like a slur, like you call someone gay. Don't be a journalist.
I don't have standards. What is this MLA you speak of?
Oh man. Well, anyway, our guest has plenty of standards. I felt like I learned some things. You felt like that, right?
Yeah,
Um,
for sure.
let's talk to Lauren. Good episode, dude. Welcome to the West Coast Sojourn podcast. Lauren Yoshiko, how are you?
I'm good. Thank you for having me back. Excited
Um,
to return.
Super glad to have you. Before I have Lev do his thing, I want to make sure that everyone knows you're the author of the venerable Sticky Bits Substack.
Thank
Venerable. You know, that's the word that comes to me when I think about that, but we can talk more about your venerability later, as opposed to your vulnerability, which is a whole different subset of the show. And also, you're the author of the book Green Scenes, A Guide to Legal Cannabis Destinations Across the U.S.
thank you very much.
So we were talking about a little bit about current events just before you jumped on here. What was your question, Lev?
Well, Lauren, thanks again for joining us. It's nice to meet you.
Yeah,
Yeah,
same.
yeah, thank you. Danelle and I, embarking on this podcast in the era of Trump point 2.0. It's kind of exhausting to avoid, repeating all the stories that come out around him and the way he just kind of generates this attention on him, no matter how hard you try to avoid it. But it's not just him; it's Elon Musk, it's Doge, it's right wing powers that be that are trying to change some basic functions of this country. And I'm just wondering, with you as a writer, you've got to respond to these current events, even if they stray outside of the cannabis realm. And how do you deal with that? How do you keep in tune with the current events, but not get overwhelmed by it as it comes at you from all directions? It's funny because before Danelle asked me to join the podcast, I was like, I want to just get off social media. I don't want to deal with any of this stuff. I want to crawl into a hole. But, it's kind of, hard to do that when you're also trying to put out content. So I'm wondering how you're doing.
It is a daily, hourly struggle, I suppose. It's interesting because the aforementioned Substack we launched, it was the Broccoli Report with Broccoli Magazine, and we were both sort of like aimless in the winter of 2020, being like, let's do something. Substack is happening. She's really interested in independent publications and was like, let's get in on this. Let's do news because that's something Broccoli Magazine doesn't really touch as a it was initially like I mean 3 times a year. And so it was like I was so unemployed that filling my time reading every possible cannabis related article was a great way to fill my time. And
Mhm.
Trump was president then, and it was sort of me touching base with all my community of business owners and weed lovers. And I was talking about every single political event that arose. I mean, I'm pretty sure I addressed everything from in my intros. It's like I addressed the that ship explosion and where is it, Beirut or no, it was
Oh,
somewhere along the coastline. You guys recall just like every random thing I was addressing because I was writing a very regular dispatch and frankly my bandwidth was wide open. I couldn't visit friends in person. It's like my entire emotional bandwidth existed to process the online.
mm,
And 4 years later, five, I'm in such a different headspace living in the world once more and not just in my little bunker of a basement apartment that I was in 2020. And it's fascinating to see how thinner my bandwidth is to process all of these things while trying to like live a somewhat normal life. My weed tolerance has gone down because I actually have probably consuming a lot less than I was in 2020, which is maybe playing a factor as well. I was just like completely chock full of THC, like, all right, give it to me, New York Times, what's next? The hits keep coming. And now I'm like, Jesus, like, give me a minute for this 5 milligram edible to hit before I reopen my phone today. But I think there's so much there because for all of us, we've got it on different platforms. Like we all have different media diets, and mine personally with the weed world, like storytelling does happen on social media a lot more than mainstream media, and I would love to take an Instagram break because of the onslaught of terror and negativity and panic, both legitimate and at times probably extreme. Um, but that's just not really in the cards when you're looking for interesting takes and interesting updates that don't really get reported in mainstream publications. So I am in it. And honestly, as some listeners know, my frequency has frankly dipped for many reasons, including a bit of an overwhelmed sense of what do I report on when it feels like everything is happening all at once, all over. And that's maybe fun for us to open up together to talk about, like, how do you choose what to talk about when there is so much happening? And yeah, I mean, Donnell's Substack is an interesting example of like, you're not strictly a cannabis publication, you're not strictly a sports publication. You talk about all kinds of things. And I'm curious, like, is that freeing? Is that more stressful, less stressful, as far as requiring you to stay tuned with the things that are happening?
I vacillate. I think sometimes it's really cathartic to be knowing what's happening because I'm looking through, I'm sifting so much with the focus on how it's impacting people on the West Coast, this new regime, that I'm immersed in it. And I generally think it's affected me positively and not be speculating. I mean, you get hung up on things. I've been hung up on this town. I don't know how well you guys know Washington State, but there's a little town that takes the ferry to Victoria. Is that ringing a Port Angeles?
Port Angeles, yeah.
Yeah, Port Angeles, and how it's been impacted by both simultaneously the Canadian boycott and the federal firings, and
Yeah.
that town has been shuttered. And when I learn about these human impacts, I don't know the real scale. Sometimes I get a little depressed. Right now it's in the stage where I'm thinking, we're bracing for the worst of it, and I like to know what's going to happen, and that's good. Now, having said that, I think I'm in a good place most of the time. I watched this movie. Are you familiar with the movie Babes, starring Elena Glazer from Broad
No,
City?
I actually have not watched that, but it's on my radar. I need to.
Okay, so it's funny, we were talking about the comedian Margaret Gomez before you got on, and Margaret Gomez had recommended it on social media. I said, let me watch this movie. And it's kind of a trite movie, but very funny, very funny. And it's about friendship at the end of the day. And in the final scene, without spoiling, I'll say that uh, the protagonist, Alana Grazer's best friend, does something that reaffirms their friendship. I see a lot of movies. I don't cry at movies, but I fucking cried because I had just been watching the Canadians talking about Trump and just the whole idea of like these people actually bought into the idea of friendship and to have friendship betrayed on such a large scale. Even you really look past it, it's tragic and it's sad. I mean, it's inconvenient, it's economically risky and all these things, but that sadness, for some reason, really got me. So sometimes I'm thinking I'm okay, and then I'm thinking I'm not, but I'm also thinking like you shouldn't be okay with that. That should be sad. You know what I'm saying?
For
Yeah,
sure.
I'd like to kind of just go back real quick. Lauren, you said that you can handle the news better under the influence. You must be an indica preference because I do sativa and I just get more and more paranoid and work up these nightmare scenarios in my mind of what's coming next, if I'm too high reading the news.
For sure, for sure. No, it's probably just the quantity, regardless of the strain. It's like enough puffs in, enough milligrams in, and you can process most things. But I definitely resonate with Donnell's finding a little balance and levity, and even yesterday I found myself talking to a friend about how I've even my newsletters frequency has dipped for also just like I've had a bit project, which is awesome, and like getting a paycheck is great. So it's been some positive reasons to have slower output right now on the Sticky Bit side because I'm helping a really cool product launch in our
Hmm.
space soon and learning how to use fucking Clavio. But
Well, we'll come back to that.
yeah, but I'm a huge consumer of film and TV and podcasts. And man, I mean, I had a similar moment over the weekend. I don't know if you guys listen to the daily weekend eps, but they did a big dive on a scrapped Prince documentary.
Mm.
By the basically this storied documentarian has been working for years with a bunch of unprecedented access to Prince's vault and created a 9-hour piece that the New York Times critic who got to screen it said is an absolute masterpiece of a complicated person, revealing, all the sides of a person and working through that in a way that is so meaningful in 2025, a sort of like in a post knee-jerk cancellation world, how do we process learning about problematic things in the past of these storied artists of our lives? And then his estate is suing, and Netflix just was like, that's not worth it for us. We'll
Mhm.
scrap it and we won't go to court over it. And so this thing is never going to be seen in theory, ever. And the guy at the end, just this documentarian processing that loss, like there's some quotes from him, and I was so moved and like upset at the end, but it also was like a refreshing reminder of like the power of creation, regardless of whether it's like acutely tied to current events. Like the world
Mhm.
would be a better place if that Prince documentary got published, got to live to see the light of day, and it's not going to. And this guy's like gonna keep doing his thing. He's gonna keep making challenging documentaries, but it did inspire me as an artist. Like, you got to keep going. Like, you got to do the things that you believe in, even if the thing you're making is a comedy called Babes, right? Like, there's meaning regardless of whether you're solving the crisis in the Middle East. There's so many things happening in life, and it's okay to be contributing to different facets of it. It was a yeah.
That's a really interesting takeaway, and I mean, that's a positive takeaway. It goes to show, I guess, perhaps you can tell me that you haven't been completely daunted by all the madness out there.
Yeah. Yeah. Life is life is full of many things, including sorrow and including loss and including anger, but also a lot of other things.
Probably get nominated to the cabinet.
Finding the creativity and how it can be relevant even if it doesn't seem relevant, how it can be needed even if it doesn't seem needed. I mean, we're in this time where we get, there's like a Trump presidency. It kind of it shakes your status quo enough to where you start looking around more. I think sometimes people stop taking certain things for granted.
Mm.
um
Mm.
and I mean, beyond that, I mean, I wonder too, like, I mean, has it affected your perception of the cannabis industry in terms of like where it's headed, or is it just going to kind of just keep flowing the way it's going just because Elon Musk likes to smoke weed?
Yeah, I mean, I would say prior to the last month, I was pretty staunchly in the position that like this isn't really gonna affect anything. Ultimately, there's weed is flowing, legal, THC, hemp THC, medical. It's flowing in every state in some way or another. Republicans are on board with it in some way or another. Even if they aren't politicians, there are Republican donor CEOs of some major cannabis companies. And that, from the people I spoke with in December and early January, it was like, it's probably not going to touch anything. There's bigger fish to fry, and it's money. It's bringing in money to governments, both blue and red, and there's not enough incentive. Now, looking back at the last 39 days or whatever, it's certainly a more chaotic start to the presidency than I expected. And I suppose the uncertainty is ramped up a bit because who the hell knows? But with RFK at Health and Human Services, I don't think there's going to be backflow. I don't think we're going to step backwards. I think we might even step forwards and most likely it will be status quo, but I wouldn't bet any money on any direction because of how unpredictable the last several months have been. I mean, tomorrow Trump could be like, we're legalizing weed and we're gonna be the global power because I don't want Germany being more powerful than us. You know, it's like God only knows. That's how I feel about that. But I also think, regardless of the presidency, there is some shifts happening. At least, let's see, how do I want to phrase it? The whole hemp THC world, it's really bumping up against some walls in some states, right? Like we're seeing more
So
and
wait,
more.
I want to interrupt you right there, because
Yeah.
that always needs a little setup, just because lay people have no idea what's going on with the.
No, good call, good call, good call. The
Yeah.
you know, we've got this multi-market situation in the US right now where you've got individual states that have legalized cannabis individually, whether it's for everyone over 21 or only medical patients with qualifying conditions. But we also have this, and that let's call that the adult use licensed market. Those are laws passed in individual states. But in 2018, the Farm Bill created this secondary market that is technically federally legal, although it isn't, although it is, where basically any anything under 0.3% THC is considered hemp and is allowed to be shipped over state lines, regardless of any local legislation. Well, that was what the 2018 Farm Bill said, and thus people started realizing, wow, if you extract CBD from hemp plants, you can then use that CBD extract and suck pure THC out of it. And now I've got THC derived from hemp, technically, that I can ship across state lines. And was that what they intended? Probably not. But that's what ambitious people figured out immediately. And they started shipping THC products all over the place. And because the Farm Bill is regulated by the FDA, who basically doesn't do anything except for send out letters to people to say, please don't make medical claims. We've created this massive market of hemp derived THC, and that 0.3% THC is calculated by weight, which makes no sense, but it means you can put a lot of THC in edibles. You can put a
Yeah.
lot of THC in drinks. And so we've got heavily intoxicating products existing under this quote unquote low THC hemp umbrella that absolutely hit as hard as something you would buy at a dispensary. Because at the end of the day, whether you extract 1 milligram of THC from a high THC a high THC cannabis plant or a low THC plant, it's going to hit the same, that 1 milligram.
So has there been like a new recent development out of DC, or where are we with this?
So there is not a new federal mandate, but a lot of states are starting to be a little wigged out. And just last year, California technically banned. So, I mean, they basically were like, no more hemp THC here as a sort of, I think, an olive branch, or even more so than an olive branch, a freaking two by four from the licensed market to be like, I think the licensed market feels a lot of competition from the hemp market, logically so, because the hemp THC world doesn't have to pay overhead, follow the regulations that state licensed adult use producers do. So there's a lot more money to be made on the hemp side, and it's putting the people who are paying to be in these state regulated systems out of business, frankly. Because if I can order a 5 milligram gummy online, why not just order it online versus go across town to a dispensary that I have to show my ID? It's a whole thing.
Wow.
So there are more and more states and bigger states that are cracking down on hemp THC product, New York, California, a handful of other ones. And something's happening, I think, in Texas right now, or just a bill was proposed, which would be a huge market that I know would
Yeah. Yeah.
hit hemp people. Because when I visited in Austin, I mean, I saw last year, I saw food trucks like in little pods selling flour just to the public, just like that, because it was technically hemp flour They were
Wow.
getting through. So it's pretty buck wild in some places. And I do think that the heyday of hemp THC is probably coming to a head, and more states are going to crack down and be like, this is nuts. Like, we've got this licensed program. You guys need to be a part of that program, or ban it altogether. That said, a lot of people are going to keep shipping it until they're told not to. So that world's crazy because no one's really watching it. There's no, it's like the FDA is literally just sending out letters to people being like, please don't do that. But that's kind of it.
What is the situation now with like banking with uh, cannabis money, right? Where is that at now federally?
In the exact same place, honestly.
Just weird. Yeah.
It is. People are still hopping from payment processor to payment processor, praying this one won't block them. A lot of people are paying massive fees on top of their usual things with any bank or community credit union that will allow them because they know they can. They know that weed related companies are desperate. People are still struggling and they're still paying taxes with suitcases of cash.
I think it was the New Republic. I read a really interesting thing about the coming sort of a corporatization of cannabis. And when you talk about what you're talking about and how, amateurish and just unprofessional that part of the industry is, I think, and tell me if I'm wrong because it's your area, Lauren, there could be a professionalization of cannabis, a corporatization of cannabis that would make ridiculousness like people still paying in with, suitcases of money a thing.
Yeah, no, it's true. And that is underway. It's like my lens has always been really focused on small business owners, just being in Portland, like we almost don't have any presence of multi-state operators here.
Right.
Because God bless Oregonians, they just want to buy from their neighbor. They want to there's like brand names do nothing for them, and I love them for that.
Mm.
But the the reality of the market at large is that the only people really in the green are those massive corporations, Trulieve, Ascend Wellness Holdings, Curaleaf, that have operations in multiple states, that have tons of white label deals where a bazillion brands are buying their flower and putting their sticker on it to be able to operate without running their own farm. And those companies probably have pretty strong. I mean, let's just say those companies are big enough that I believe Trulieve last year basically played a game of chicken with the IRS of like, we are going to the big thing for weed people with the taxes is not being able to claim business expenses, right? Cost of goods, the
Right.
whole
Right.
10,
280.
what is it? 280.
280E.
And
280E.
yeah, Trulieve was like, what if we do? And did
Really?
not pay they like took the 280, they filed their taxes, like several years of taxes, taking like claiming 280E expenses and being like, you can't legally do this. And I don't remember if they won or not, but I'm pretty sure they did. And don't quote me on that, but the point is like they're big enough to actually explore that option, right? Like they are choosing to not pay millions of dollars in taxes because they're sort of like, I don't know, like take us to court, let's see what happens. So
Mm.
corporatization is definitely happening on that scale. We do not see it as much in Oregon. In California, I do feel like it's still a bit wild because you hear crazy. I mean, yeah, the MedMen implosion, the Ease implosion, bankruptcies, no one's getting payouts. I don't know. It still feels a little wild compared to the corporate imaginings I have of some of these big dogs. But yeah, it's certainly, I mean, everything goes corporate as it grows, right? And the people who are just like satisfied being small will stay small, but they're going to either have to face the choice of like, do I sell or do I quit at some point? Because That's the two options at the end of the day.
Yeah.
It's like a weird realization to have as I accidentally became a business reporter through writing weed reviews.
Let me pivot just a little bit. You don't mind if I do that, do you? Do we
Not
like?
at all. Derail me.
Okay. Well, that's funny. I had a dirty joke that I am going to suppress right now. It was for you last year going out with your book in an industry that was experiencing various degrees of depression. Now, I know you went around the country, so you saw a lot of different scenes, but can you tell us what that was like for you?
It was depressing as hell. I have not sold a ton of books.
Oh, okay.
It's fascinating. No, you're spot on. And honestly, I should say I actually did not travel everywhere in writing that book, but I did get to write about some markets that I had visited. But last year, just to be, yeah, it's like a lot of that traveling happened in 2018 to 2022, and then 2023, writing that book, and it came out in spring of 2024, and in 2021 and 2022. 420 was really gaining steam. Like I want to look at it through the lens of 420 as far as like media coverage. We were seeing everyone had 420 coverage. There was gift guides in The Strategist, Vanity Fair gift guides, beauty magazine gift guides, people writing about women in weed and these culinary figures in weed. And Condé Nast wants to hear about weed destinations. And I'm getting reached out for coverage every April, just falling in my lap. And then in 2024, it just stopped.
Hmm.
Like in
Yeah.
2023, I probably still got a few gigs. And in 2024, it was crickets. None of the usual big brands did their obligatory weed mention in April. Um, and I think part of that has to do with the election year, honestly. Like it took up so much space that there was less consideration for these usual calendar moments, I think. And also, the weed world was taking a real dip. But at the same time, it's like, I don't know, new states were still coming online. Like, it's still interesting momentum. And so the election, I think, had a lot to do with it. But on my end, once the book released, I did not get much. I mean, I didn't get any mention. I got a few small press hits, but they weren't from big outlets.
Mm.
And there were even just outside of my book coverage, but just me reading, I couldn't tell you one larger magazine gift guide that I saw, virtual or otherwise, around that time, which is usually, the one time a year you do see write-ups about accessories and stuff. And then just selling through on the book, it's like a lot of my customers are cannabis business owners or people interested in getting into the industry or people that love weed. And everyone took a hit last year. It was rough across the board. Most states dipped, and a lot of places shuttered. And so I actually have experienced, I think, a really different launch than I would have if this book came out 2 years earlier. I'm good friends with Menlay Agre, who wrote a book, The Art of Weed Butter, back in, I think it published in 2018.
Right.
And she told me when I was first getting this book deal figured out, she was like, mine was small, indie publisher, super, super indie publisher. And she still gets royalties
Mm.
a few times a year of books selling. And I will tell you, I have not gotten my first royalty check yet because I don't think they've sold enough books to even pay through my advance yet, which was not massive.
Yeah, but that's the book world these days.
In 2023 and 2024, I saw Michigan and California and um, Washington, but most of the rest of my research was from my desk in Portland, and it was a lot of working with the network I have, doing a lot of interviews, doing a lot of calls. And I know that there is, even just from my phone calls, like there was and is positive momentum out there. But it's sad. I feel like it is a little less connected than it was. And part of that is like media coverage. You know, I have my little footprint, but in the grand scheme of things, like it's hard for a cannabis consumption lounge in Massachusetts to get on the radar of my newsletter because we don't share mutuals on LinkedIn. Like they're part of a totally separate weed community. And I, um,
Mm.
it's cool to doing the research for the book was amazing because I got to drop into all these networks and they would be like, "Oh, you should talk to my friend who
Right.
runs this farm. You should talk to this guy who makes these pipes." And I got to see like who the connectors are and where these hubs are created and how they're created and the people that are really working hard to create hubs. And that's really what the book ended up being about. But I can't help but feel like we are still in this weird rut. Not rut. We are still not treated to the same degree in like the grand scheme of pop culture storytelling.
Right.
Like most weed coverage is still legalization coverage and drug busts.
Now,
It's kind of the same thing.
why do you think that is?
The pipeline of writers getting to work at Willamette Week for my first bite of the written world, it showed me how like, okay, there is a familiar ladder. I start writing movie reviews and strain reviews for this local paper. They teach me about AP. They teach me how to pitch. They teach me what a good headline is and how to have a answer all the who, what, where, when, why in an article. And then I get my name out there. And then other outlets looking for that kind of coverage say, "Oh, Lauren, would you like to write it for this weed magazine? Can we ask you to do this?" And then you move up the food chain in your specialty. And if there aren't well, let's start there. If there aren't local media outlets, which is an unfortunate reality in so many parts of the country, the pipeline, there is no new writers being put into that pipeline. And writers that have been covering agriculture or food or business for 40 years, they are not thinking about cannabis as a part of their logical beat because it never has been. It's
Right.
only been a part of the crime beat and the politics beat. And so part of it is the unfortunate state of media, of independent media, right? Where we're seeing all these smaller places shutter, which is unfortunate because that's the entryway for so many young, fresh, interested, curious writers that are plugged into uh underground scenes like cannabis, which is underground whether it likes it or not still. But that's a big thing in my eyes is like we need to have a better pipeline for young new writers to get quality chops that then give them enough experience to be good enough writers to write for more uh, publications with bigger distribution. Just learn how to write like SEO puff pieces,
Mhm.
and that's not going to get them a New Yorker piece about shifting cannabis trends and et cetera, et cetera. So every once in a while there's a flicker of something where it's like just an effortless coverage of a thing that makes sense. Like Edie Parker had a great feature in the fashion section of the New York Times.
Hmm.
Like that makes sense.
About
They're
what?
a fashion forward brand. It was less about the product and more about the people and the brand and the person. There's a an outlet in Arizona somewhere that's kind of like a luxury bougie local happenings type of thing. They were the ones that put this infused event series on my radar that is phenomenal. They're like popping up an infused dinner in the middle of Grand Tetons National Park. And that makes so much sense to me. Like that is who should be covering it. And I love seeing those aspects of the industry show up in different niches just effortlessly. It's not like it's this special 420 edition and so then we're going to throw a bone out to the weed people. There are cannabis stories that make sense in Bloomberg, in Bon Appetit, in Mary Claire, you know, it's a vertical that has a lot of different angles that are really exciting and interesting and new. There was a guy I spoke to in Boston area who's just a nerd of a scientific weed chef, and he's like, I'm interested in making infused ice cream, but I'm also interested in figuring out how to cure cheese in a way that infuses it like in the cave. What? Like, give this guy a feature in one of our prestige food magazines yesterday. Like, that's more interesting than half of the pup pieces I read from, Food and Wine last year or whatever. So I'm hungry to see more, just like, yeah, incorporation into storytelling on every level because there is a lot going on in the industry. And even just having like a cannabis beat doesn't actually make sense to me. It makes more sense for it to be a part of other beats.
I love the way you talk about this stuff. Have you considered starting a consultancy?
I'm sure, but not really. I've had instances where founders have reached out to me to call, and I'm thinking, oh, they want me to interview them and they want me to write something about them for something, and we have a fun chat. And then I realize at the end of the call, they're like waiting for me to pitch them on my consulting. And I'm like, I don't know, who do you want me to pitch you to?
But you're just a hardcore Willamette Weekly reporter, and
I
you
know,
do that sort of
it's
thing. That's
hard.
good.
And because I haven't come from the business world in my experiences, I'm like, I have like the hardest time. I would have the hardest time taking people's money for business savvy things because it's like, well, I've never run a business. I've never dealt with a cap table. I've never looked at a supply chain that deeply. I talk to people and I like buying weed and enjoying it and hearing people's stories. But the business side, I'm like scared to give people advice because hell if I know. Hell if anyone knows. There's so much failure, and I say that in the most like loving and not depressed way.
Oh, I know. But
But there's a
having
lot.
said that, there are a lot of people who would gladly do this thing that you're not doing.
It also feels like it's weird with like edibles and stuff and gummies. It's allowed the cannabis culture to become even more pervasive throughout society, right? Like I hear about like my aunt. Oh yeah, she eats gummies, whereas she would never talk about that thing before. So it's like almost like more people are using it and it's more accepted, but then it's kind of quieter in a way too, because maybe it's less controversial or something.
That's fair. I mean, that's fair. It's no longer this shocking new thing on the block and thus less clickbaity. That's unfortunately probably a factor.
Like I'm always interested too, like in these larger meta trends, right? Because you hear now about how like younger kids these days don't drink alcohol as much. And for me, like cannabis is kind of an alternative to alcohol because I'm not a big drinker. But like, is that part of it? Are kids these days just using less substances across the board? I mean, I kind of find that hard to believe.
Same, same. I find that super hard to believe. I think they're addicted to other things and literal things. I
That implied something. What do you mean by that?
I
Literal.
mean I mean even just saying like, oh, they're addicted to social media. It's like, no, I think they're doing drugs still. It's just different drugs.
Right.
I think
Right.
they're like screw TikTok. I think they're addicted to Zen. I think they're taking ketamine.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right.
And I find it I think it's totally possible that they're not drinking in the same way, which like we get that. Drinking makes you feel terrible.
Yeah.
There's like other drugs that have less of an immediate hangover, and I can understand why. They're also like more health conscious. I was listening to Demi Moore's autobiography this past week, and she talks about getting into coke in like the heyday of, the Brat Pack 80s. And her reason for getting into coke was she actually had a kidney problem. And as a youth was like, oh, awesome. Like this is the healthy drug. It doesn't make me gain weight. It doesn't hurt my kidneys and I can get fucked up. And like, I do think that thought process is probably very common with Gen Z, where it's like they are more health conscious. They're like, alcohol is bad for me, but I can take this other thing that ketamine's a pain treatment now that's like normalized in hospitals. And same even with pharmaceuticals, unfortunately. Like people get prescribed painkillers, so it innately is considered probably, even though I hope they're paying attention to shit like dope sick and seeing that
Mm.
there is a long-term health
Right.
cost eventually. But yeah, I think they're still doing shit. It's
Can
just
I say something that's only tangentially related, but it just you made me think of it. I thought about this today, like all this stuff about the fentanyl that's coming in from Canada, and you know those people who
Wait. Is that a real thing or is that
no,
just
no,
Donald
it's
Trump
not.
fake
But I'm
news?
just saying that it can even be a thing, even with Mexico to
Yeah.
an extent. When those people who pushed out that synthetic opioid, what's the name of that family? That they were punished with a fine of
the
millions.
Sacklers.
The Sacklers, yeah.
Oh, right.
Why
That,
aren't we putting
yeah.
them in jail if you're so hardcore about drug abuse? It's just a
Oh
pretext.
my gosh,
It's
makes
just
me
a
so
pretext,
mad.
I know, but that standing right in your face really kind of bothers me. A lot of things standing right in my face bother me. Um, were you going to say something?
I was also going to say like mushrooms, right? The microdosing
Oh
of
yeah.
mushrooms, and mushrooms seem to be a bit more popular, or at
How do
least
you feel
people
about
seem to know more.
microdosing, Lauren?
I have not. Donnell and I already talked about my UC Santa Cruz origins, just like heavily impaired, wandering through redwoods on 3 grams of mushrooms. So microdosing is still sort of in my brain. It is not normalized into my day to day. Mushrooms are still like a special occasion thing in my brain, which I know is very, it's very outdated of me at this point. And I haven't incorporated it into like the average weekly rhythm. And I should, I mean, I should experiment more with the many microdosed mushrooms, chocolates that have ended up in my doorstep. But, um,
Do
I'm all
you
for it.
do you know Zeus Tapato? Are you familiar with him?
I don't.
He's a big enthusiast in the psychedelic realm here. He's actually studying, I want to say in Sweden right now. He's getting his PhD. He used to do the Stone Video Gamers League, the Games Stone Gamers League it was called. He thinks that microdosing is the biggest scam ever and that there's just nothing
That's
to
so
it. And,
funny.
yeah, and he's really adamant. I'll share my TikTok I did with him, but I wondered if you were an advocate, but it doesn't even sound like you're a fan of the microdosing.
It's not something I've adopted, but I'm totally an advocate. I mean, I'm totally pro people. At the end of the day, like, I'm pro people trying different forms of plant medicine, period. End of sentence, right? Like, I'm very hesitant for anyone to try a prescription pill with so many risks associated with it when a mind-altering substance could help really get to the root cause and not just numb whatever you're feeling right now. Because even though I'm not microdosing in my day-to-day, I remember and I know what it's like to have that feeling of your mind just being in a totally different perspective and how important that is to help you just sort of have objectivity in your day to day. Like getting rocked like that. I'm talking about taking many grams, not a microdose, but even in a microdose, I'm sure you feel just, you look at things in a different light. And that's so important when we can get such tunnel vision. And that tunnel vision is anxiety inducing, depression inducing. And what if just trying this mind altering thing can help you see things differently in a way that you don't need to take a pill daily?
Yeah. Do we all agree that Oregon's the best place to do shrooms?
Yeah, I
To
would
do
definitely
shrooms? Is that what you
to
said?
consume most substances, I think, and food to consume, period.
It's a consumption state. That should be the motto. Yeah, I mean, I haven't done shrooms in Delaware. Maybe it's amazing.
No, and honestly, one of the places of all the places after writing that book that I'm hyped to go smoke and eat and drink in is Vermont. I need to
Really?
get out there. There's such a farmer culture, such a mirrored, like, we don't care about the fancy names. We just want quality product grown locally. They've got some really cool, both there in Maine, some really interesting small grower programs where like the law was written to allow, I don't remember which state, but one of them or both of them, it's like you can grow weed in your backyard and legally sell it at dispensaries. All
Um,
good.
so Lauren, I mean, Umpqua Valley down in Roseburg, that's a beautiful place too, I imagine, to partake and experience everything. Except I get scared of the people around there sometimes.
Yeah, yeah, you are not alone. The Definitely a beautiful place. Definitely some killer farms, both smokable and edible, and vineyards as well. But yeah, that's a there's good people sprinkled in, and but it's a tough majority down there.
Yeah, I used to work as an environmental advocate for Osberg, and we were working on this pesticide right to know bill, and I remember we had to go in front of like the state legislature committee on, I don't know if it was on agriculture or whatever, but the representative from Roseburg, he just started going on this tangent. He's like, "Well, if I just took my door off my truck and burned it on my front porch, would I have to report that?"
My
And
goodness.
I was like, "What are you smoking, man?" Like, oh,
Classic. Classic. We had a county commissioner come into the high school and just remove every abortion information pamphlet that was there at the health center. Just like walk in one day and do that off her own accord.
Wow. Wow, that's a crazy Oregon story. I want to make sure before you get off here that we find out because you alluded to a project you're doing. Can you talk about that sort of thing, or is it sort of stuff that you try to keep private?
Man, great question. Great question. Should probably look back at the original contract. But I think at this point, when is this going to go live? When will this publish?
A couple days.
Couple days. It's coming out in a couple days. Miss Grass is launching an edible that I've gotten to help work on, and really the first time I've gotten to work on a product launch from inception to launch of like helping name a product, helping choose the flavors and the ingredients, helping choose the visual world, and it's good. It's
What's that
damn
like?
good.
How's it different? I
It's
mean, how are you differently engaged?
I have never built a product up like that. I've never played a role in like every step of it coming to fruition. So that's been fun on the brand side doing that. I've worked at one other cannabis company on the inside in Oregon and got to kind of get a taste of that, but I was still coming in at the tail end, and it's just cool to see something. I'm getting a taste of what business owners experience of like, oh, I worked so hard on this thing, and now I'm getting to see it go out into the world. I mean, not unlike a book, but it's fun to create something that people get to eat and have
Yeah.
like adventurous highs of. And I'm excited to hear people's stories because I've really enjoyed the sampling rounds personally. So I can't wait for it to launch.
Can you tell us when you're looking at this cannabis future, do you have plans? Does it make sense to plan for what you're going to do down the road?
Hmm. Does it ever make sense to plan? No, I honestly, even just to bookend like the sort of spiraling conversation we had at the beginning, like there is only the future to look forward to, right? If we're not excited and hopeful and interested in doing something, then what's the point of all of it? You know, it's like that is the point. Even if the world was ending tomorrow, like what am I gonna eat for dinner tonight? Let's make it fucking special, you know? There's no point other than to live and like live in the biggest, best, truest way. So I'm gonna keep doing what I'm doing. I'm certainly more inspired than ever to add to the storytelling, work hard to provide diverse perspectives to as many people as possible just with our narrowing media landscape. I feel like we have a really important duty right now to write and write well because that is fleeting and
Mm.
everything just with the faith in storytelling, faith in news outlets, like let's let's provide something trustworthy and mind opening out there because I think that we need it a lot and that I feel good about doing.
Lauren Yoshiko, that was delicious. I have to say,
Thank you so much for having me. It's always fun to talk with a couple other writers.
man, gracing us with your presence. It was really cool. That last part really knocks everything home. Take care.
Yeah, I
Take
appreciate you,
care.
Lauren. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you guys. See you out there.